There is a specific silence that people who grew up in the 1970s still carry inside them. It's not just nostalgia. It's not just a preference for the good old days. It is a fundamental psychological wiring shaped by a world that quite literally no longer exists. They learn to be still, to be alone without needing constant stimulation, to find meaning in silence, boredom, and unstructured freedom. And now, decades later, they find themselves living in a reality that demands the exact opposite: constant connection, relentless noise, and perpetual performance. To outsiders, they might seem stuck in the past, or perhaps antisocial. But internally, they are preserving something the rest of the world traded away without even noticing: the ability to be at peace with their own company. Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher of solitude, once observed that a man can be himself only so long as he is alone, and if he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom, for it is only when he is alone that he is really free. Perhaps that is exactly what happened to this generation. They built fortresses inside themselves during a time when childhood still had space, silence, and the freedom to simply exist. They are not avoiding the present. They are safeguarding the quiet truth inside them, a truth that says, peace doesn't come from fitting in. It comes from finally letting go. And if this feels familiar, if you often feel like a stranger in a world addicted to speed, you are about to understand why you never really adjusted and why that is actually your greatest strength. The 1970s were the last decade where childhood still had room to breathe. Think back to the texture of those days. No screens glowing in your pocket, no constant supervision, no scheduled activities designed to optimize every hour of the day to build a resume for a child who hasn't even hit puberty yet. Just time, long, unstructured, sometimes heavy stretches of time. Do you remember the specific feeling of a Saturday afternoon when there was absolutely nothing to do? The dust motes dancing in the sunlight coming through the window. The silence of the house. The only instruction from your parents was, go outside, come back when the street lights turn on. And in that emptiness, something profound happened. Something that modern psychology is only now beginning to understand the value of. Children learn to be with themselves. They didn't have a device to save them from boredom. So they had to walk through the boredom. They had to sit with it until it transformed into something else: curiosity, creativity, or a quiet form of contentment. They read books for hours, sprawled on the living room floor, lost in worlds that existed only in their heads. They rode bikes to nowhere in particular, just to feel the wind and the rhythm of their own legs. They built forts in their backyards that no adult ever saw, creating sanctuaries where they made the rules. They spent entire afternoons doing absolutely nothing. And it didn't feel like wasted time. It felt like living. Rilke, the poet who understood the depths of the inner life, wrote about the importance of vast solitudes in childhood. He believed that this space was necessary for the soul to grow roots. And that's what this generation did. They grew deep roots. They learned that being alone didn't mean being lonely. It meant being free, but the world didn't stay that way. Somewhere between the neon rush of the 1980s and the digital explosion of today, childhood became a performance, a resume, a constant audition for future success. Parents began scheduling every moment. Schools began measuring every outcome. Society began treating solitude as a warning sign, a symptom of social failure, instead of a natural and healthy state. Silence became suspicious. Unstructured time became dangerous. And the ability to be alone, once celebrated as independence, became reframed as isolation. The world sped up. Technology arrived, promising connection, but delivering distraction. Connection became constant, shallow, and exhausting. Social media turned relationships into performances. Work bled into home. Noise became the default setting of life. And the people who grew up in the 1970s, they never adjusted to that shift. Not because they couldn't. They are intelligent, capable, adaptable people. But because something deep inside them refused to, here is the intermediate layer of emotion that is rarely discussed. It's not that they hate the modern world. It's that they feel a constant, low-level friction with it. It's the friction of having a nervous system built for depth, trying to operate in a world built for speed. When someone from this generation says they prefer staying home, they are not being antisocial. They are protecting the internal world they spent decades building. When they decline invitations, they are not avoiding people. They are avoiding the performance that modern socializing demands. Because somewhere along the way, being around others stopped feeling like connection. It started feeling like a chore, a second job where you have to smile, engage, and pretend that the shallow small talk isn't draining your soul drop by drop. Think about the last time you were at a crowded social event. The noise, the forced laughter, the pressure to be on. Do you remember that moment when you excused yourself to go to the bathroom, not because you needed to use it, but just to lock the door and stand in the silence for 30 seconds? Just to take a deep breath and remember who you are. That is the friction. That is the clash between your nature and the world's demands. They tried, for years, sometimes decades, they tried to keep up with a world that values noise over depth. They showed up to parties they didn't want to attend. They maintained friendships that felt more like obligations than connections. They forced themselves into social rhythms that never quite fit. They wore the mask. Jung called it the persona, the face we present to the world to be accepted. But for this generation, the persona has become incredibly heavy. It weighs a ton, and then, one day, they stopped carrying it. They gave themselves permission to stay home, to guard their energy, to choose solitude over half-hearted connections. And the relief they felt when they made that choice, it was immediate, undeniable, like finally setting down a heavy backpack they'd been carrying since 1995. Let's go a little deeper into this feeling. There is a psychological concept called social exhaustion, but for the 1970s generation, it goes beyond just being tired. It's an existential fatigue. Schopenhauer used a famous metaphor for this, the porcupines. He described a group of porcupines on a cold winter day. To keep warm, they crowd close together, but when they get too close, their quills prick each other, causing pain, so they move apart. But then they get cold again. They are caught in a cycle of freezing or being stabbed. Eventually, they find a moderate distance, a space where they are warm enough, but not close enough to be hurt. People who grew up in the 1970s have mastered this moderate distance. For most of the modern world, socializing is seen as the only source of warmth. They are willing to endure the pricks of shallow conversation, drama, and performance just to avoid the cold of solitude. But this generation discovered that they have their own internal fire. They don't need to crowd together to stay warm. They don't hate people. They are not misanthropes. They are not broken. They just learned early on that their richest experiences happen internally, in books, in thought, in quiet observation, in the sanctuary of their own minds. Schopenhauer understood this perfectly. He wrote that, "A man who has much in himself has need of nothing from outside." People with deep inner lives don't need the external world to entertain them constantly. They carry entire universes inside themselves. They don't require constant stimulation because they've cultivated something far more valuable: the ability to be content in their own presence. And that is exactly what happened to this generation. They built those universes young, and now, decades later, they still live there. The interesting part is that this wasn't a conscious choice. It wasn't a philosophy they adopted or a lifestyle they designed on a mood board. It was simply the natural result of growing up in a world that allowed them to be still. They didn't have screens to fill every moment of boredom. They didn't have social media to validate every thought. They didn't have constant connectivity to numb every uncomfortable feeling. So they learned to sit with discomfort, to navigate boredom, to find meaning in the quiet spaces between events. And that skill, the ability to be alone without needing rescue, became the foundation of who they are. It is why, decades later, they can spend entire weekends at home and feel no urge to leave. It is why they can go weeks without seeing anyone and feel no sense of loss, but rather a sense of restoration. It is why they prefer their own company to shallow socializing, not because they are antisocial, but because they learned something the modern world forgot, that peace isn't found in constant connection. It's found in the freedom to simply be. This quiet shift is happening all over the world. People who grew up in the 1970s are realizing that the life they were told to want, busy, social, constantly connected, was never the life they actually needed. If this resonates with you, if you feel this friction between your upbringing and the modern world, you are not alone. This channel is a quiet corner of the internet, designed specifically for people who choose depth over noise. Before we continue to the final realization, I want to invite you to stay. Subscribe if this feels like home. Share in the comments. What is the one thing from your childhood that you miss most in today's world? Let's continue, because what comes next is where everything becomes clearer. I want to talk to you now, not about you. If you are watching this, there is a good chance you recognize yourself in this pattern. You grew up in a time when being alone was normal, expected even. You spent hours in your own company, and it didn't feel like a problem. It felt like peace. But then the world changed, and suddenly, the thing that once felt natural, your preference for solitude, your need for quiet, your disinterest in constant socializing, became something you had to defend. People started asking, why don't you go out more? Don't you get lonely? Aren't you worried about missing out? And maybe, for a while, you believed them. Maybe you tried to adjust, to force yourself into a social rhythm that never quite fit, to attend events you didn't want to attend, to maintain friendships that felt more like obligations than connections. But it didn't work, because the world wasn't asking you to connect, it was asking you to perform. And after years of performing, you finally stopped. You came home. You closed the door. You let the silence settle around you like a warm blanket. And for the first time in a long time, you felt like yourself again. But here is the secret trap. Here is the shadow that follows the relief. When plans get cancelled, you feel relief. Instant, undeniable relief. A physical loosening of the chest, and then, almost immediately, you feel guilty for feeling relieved. Why? Because the world taught you that relief is selfish, that preferring to stay home means you are antisocial, cold, or broken, that a good person should always want to be around others. But that relief isn't selfishness. It is your body telling you the truth. It is your nervous system saying, this is what I need, this is where I feel safe. It is the wisdom of the 1970s child inside you, reminding you that you were fine before the noise started, and you are fine without it now. And after decades of ignoring that voice, you are finally listening. There is something else worth noticing about this guilt. It often comes from a place of empathy. You care about people. You don't want to disappoint them. But you have realized that you cannot set yourself on fire to keep others warm. People who grew up in the 1970s often have a complicated relationship with the present. They look around at the modern world, the constant notifications, the performative social media, the shallow busyness, and they feel out of place. Like travelers who arrived in a country where they don't speak the language, not because they failed to keep up, but because they never wanted to. They remember a time when life moved slower, when conversations had depth, when you could sit in silence with someone and it didn't feel awkward, when being alone didn't require an explanation. And now, in a world that values speed, noise, and constant stimulation, they feel like strangers. But here is the truth. They are not the ones who are lost. The world is. Pay attention to this part. This is the validation you have been waiting for. The modern world operates on a very specific assumption, that more connection equals a better life, that being social is inherently good, that solitude is a problem to be solved. But that assumption is wrong, because connection without depth isn't connection. It's performance. It's noise. It's the illusion of intimacy without any of the substance. And people who grew up in the 1970s learned this early. They learned that one deep conversation is worth more than 100 shallow ones. That one quiet afternoon alone is more restorative than a week of forced socializing. They learned that quality matters more than quantity, that peace matters more than popularity, that authenticity matters more than approval. And once you learn that lesson, you can't unlearn it. You can't go back to pretending that the noise satisfies you. Schopenhauer believed that the more someone needs external validation, the less they have inside themselves. He argued that the ordinary man is gregarious and social because he cannot bear his own company. He runs to others to escape the emptiness of his own mind. But the person with a rich inner life, they run to their own mind to escape the emptiness of the crowd. And maybe that is the real difference. People who grew up in the 1970s built something inside themselves that the modern world never taught them to need. Self-sufficiency, emotional independence, the ability to be content without constant input. They don't need the world to entertain them. They don't need social approval to feel valid. They don't need to fill every moment with noise. They learned, early on, that the richest life happens in the quiet spaces, in the moments between, in the freedom to simply be. And that is not something they lost. It is something they protected. There is a profound difference between solitude and loneliness. Loneliness is the ache of wanting connection and not having it. It is the feeling that something is missing, that you are on the outside looking in, that the world is happening somewhere else, without you. Solitude is different. Solitude is chosen. It is deliberate. It is the joy of your own company. It is the peace that comes from not needing anyone else to feel whole. And people who grew up in the 1970s, they learned solitude young. They learned that being alone could be rich, creative, and deeply satisfying. But the world doesn't always see it that way. The world sees someone who stays home and assumes they are lonely. It sees someone who declines invitations and assumes they are depressed. It sees someone who prefers their own company and assumes something is wrong, but nothing is wrong. What is happening is this. They are choosing peace over performance, clarity over chaos, depth over distraction. They are not running away from life. They are running toward the life that actually feels like theirs. Let me be clear about something. This isn't about rejecting people. It isn't about becoming a hermit or cutting yourself off from the world completely. It is about recognizing that your need for solitude isn't a flaw. It is a feature. It is a superpower in a noisy world. It is about understanding that the life you were told to want, busy, social, constantly connected, was never designed for people like you. You were designed for depth, for quiet, for the kind of life that happens in the margins, away from the noise, and there is nothing wrong with that. The world will keep moving fast. It will keep demanding performance, noise, and constant availability. But you don't have to keep up. You can stay home. You can guard your peace. You can choose your own company over shallow connections. And when the world asks why, you don't owe it an explanation. You don't owe it an apology. Because the people who grew up in the 1970s learned something the rest of the world forgot. Freedom isn't found in fitting in. It is found in finally letting go. If this resonated with you, I'd love to hear your story. What part of growing up in the 1970s shaped who you are today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. A quiet corner of the internet for people who choose solitude over half-hearted connections.